Most child development experts agree that crying children can be soothed with one of three universal techniques: food, comfort, or distraction. On a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in October, Elena Rodriguez tried none of those things. Instead, she stood frozen behind the coffee station at Nonna's family restaurant, watching a 6-year-old boy's tears carve silent tracks down his cheeks, while his father sat helpless beside him, and she recognized something that made her chest tighten with familiar dread. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop 10 degrees when they'd walked through the door. Eleanor had been refilling sugar dispensers for the 3rd time that shift, her calloused fingers moving through the motions with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been invisible for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. The stained apron tied around her waist bore the evidence of 14 hours on her feet. Coffee splashes, marinara sauce, the ghost of a child's sticky handprint from the lunch rush. Her dark hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it gave her a headache, but headaches were easier to ignore than the alternative of looking unprofessional. She was 28 years old, and she had perfected the art of being nobody. Then he walked in. The man wore a suit that cost more than Nonna's annual revenue, charcoal grey, tailored to a terrifying perfection that made every other patron look underdressed in comparison. His dark hair was swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and controlled intensity. But it wasn't his expensive clothes or his commanding presence that made Elena's hands pause mid-pour over the sugar dispenser. It was the way he carried the crying child. The boy couldn't have been older than 6, small and fragile against his father's broad chest, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. The child's sobs weren't the demanding wails of a spoiled tantrum. They were the quiet, desperate sounds Elena remembered from her own childhood, the crying of someone who had learned that loud emotions brought unwanted attention, but who couldn't stop the tears from coming anyway. The hostess, Maria, approached their table with the nervous energy of someone who recognized expensive trouble when she saw it. Elena watched the exchange from across the dining room, noting how the man's voice remained low and controlled even as his son's distress escalated. How he checked his watch twice in 30 seconds. How his fingers drummed against the white tablecloth with barely restrained frustration. "Table 12 is getting antsy," whispered Tommy, one of the other servers, appearing at Elena's elbow with a tray of dirty dishes. "Kid's been crying for 20 minutes straight. Other customers are starting to complain." Elena nodded without taking her eyes off the scene unfolding across the restaurant. The man had ordered something. She could see Maria scribbling on her notepad, but the boy hadn't stopped crying. If anything, the tears were coming harder now, accompanied by the kind of hitching breaths that suggested he'd been crying for much longer than 20 minutes. "Rich guy probably doesn't know what to do with his own kid," Tommy continued, oblivious to the way Elena's jaw had tightened. "Betty's got nannies for everything, doesn't know how to handle real parenting when the kid acts up." But Elena could see what Tommy couldn't. This wasn't a father who was disconnected from his child. This was a father who was drowning. The man's hand hovered over his son's back, as if he wanted to offer comfort, but didn't know how. His expensive watch caught the light as he reached for his water glass, then set it down without drinking. Everything about his body language screamed competence and control, but faced with his crying child, he looked lost. The boy's cries grew louder, and Eleanor watched 3 separate tables turn to stare. An elderly couple at table 6 shook their heads in obvious disapproval. A business dinner at table 9 paused their conversation to glare in their direction. Maria hurried past Elena's station, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Boss wants to know if we should ask them to move to the private dining room," Maria muttered, "kids disrupting the whole restaurant." Elena's fingers tightened around the sugar dispenser. She knew what moving to the private dining room meant. It meant being hidden away because their presence was inconvenient. It meant being treated like a problem to be managed rather than human beings who deserved compassion. She'd spent enough of her childhood being shuffled into back rooms and quiet corners to recognise the sting of polite rejection. "He's not being disruptive," Elena said quietly. He's hurting. Maria paused, notepad in hand. What? Look at him. Elena nodded toward the boy, who had buried his face against his father's shoulder, small body shaking with exhaustion. That's not a tantrum, that's grief. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. The way the boy clutched his stuffed rabbit, the way his father's hands trembled slightly as he tried to smooth his son's hair, the careful distance both of them maintained from the world around them, as if they were wrapped in invisible armour that kept everyone else out. Elena had worn that same armour for most of her life. She untied her apron with steady hands, ignoring the way her pulse hammered against her throat. This was insane. This was exactly the kind of thing that got people like her fired, or worse. The man at table 12 didn't look like someone who appreciated interference from restaurant staff. He looked like someone who could make problems disappear, but the boy's quiet sobbing cut through every logical argument her survival instincts could muster. Elena smoothed her hair, straightened her black uniform shirt, and walked across the restaurant like she had every right to be there. The closer she got to their table, the more details came into focus. The man's eyes were a startling shade of green, currently fixed on his son with an expression of barely controlled desperation. His hands were large and strong, the kind that suggested he was accustomed to handling problems with direct action, but they hovered uselessly over the crying child, as if he was afraid his touch might cause more damage. The boy, Marco, she realised, having overheard his father use the name, looked exactly like a miniature version of the man beside him. Same dark hair, same sharp jawline, same green eyes that were currently red-rimmed with tears. But where his father radiated controlled power, Marco seemed to be crumbling from the inside out. Elena reached their table and stopped. The man's head snapped up, his green eyes locking onto hers with the kind of intensity that made lesser people step back and apologise for existing. His expression was a masterclass in controlled hostility, clearly expecting her to deliver some polite but firm request for them to leave. Instead, Eleanor looked directly at the crying child and said, "Hi, Marco." The effect was immediate. The boy's head lifted from his father's shoulder, tear-streaked face turning toward her voice. For just a moment, the crying stopped, replaced by surprise at hearing his name from a stranger. The man's eyes narrowed dangerously. "How do you—" "I heard you say it earlier," Elena said calmly, never taking her eyes off Marco. "I'm Elena, I work here." She crouched down until she was at the boy's eye level, ignoring the way his father's entire body tensed like a coiled spring. This close, she could see the exhaustion written in every line of Marco's small face. The way he clutched his stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. The careful way he avoided looking directly at anyone, as if eye contact might shatter what little composure he had left. "That's a very special rabbit," Elena said softly, nodding toward the worn toy. "What's his name?" Marco's lower lip trembled, but he whispered, "Cornelio." "Cornelio," Elena repeated, her pronunciation careful and respectful. "That's a beautiful name. Italian for rabbit, right?" The smallest nod. Elena felt her heart break a little at the tentative hope that flickered across Marco's features. She glanced up at his father, noting the way the man's knuckles had gone white where they gripped the edge of the table. He was wound so tight she was surprised he hadn't exploded yet, but there was something in his eyes that stopped her from retreating. Desperation. The kind that came from watching someone you love suffer and being powerless to fix it. "I'm not here about the noise," Elena said quietly, addressing the man directly for the first time. "I'm here about Marco." The silence that followed was suffocating. Elena could feel the weight of every stare in the restaurant, the collective held breath of customers and staff alike, waiting to see what would happen next. The man's green eyes searched her face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading people for lies, for weakness, for threats. But Eleanor held his gaze steadily, her hands folded calmly in her lap as she remained crouched beside their table. She'd spent too many years being dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated to be intimidated now. Whatever this man was, whatever power he held, his son was crying, and that trumped everything else. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was low, controlled, with the faintest hint of an accent that suggested old-world roots. "You think you know what my son needs?" It wasn't really a question. It was a challenge, delivered with the kind of quiet menace that probably made grown men confess their sins. But Elena had been raised by the foster care system, had learned to navigate dangerous personalities and impossible situations since she was barely older than Marco. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Instead, she looked back at Marco, who had stopped crying altogether now, watching their exchange with the wide-eyed attention of a child who had learned to read adult emotions for his own survival. "I think," Elena said carefully, "that Marco is tired of being brave all the time. And sometimes, when you're 6 years old and the world feels too big and scary, all the food and toys and distractions in the world won't help. Sometimes you just need someone to understand that you're not crying because you're spoiled or difficult." She paused, noting the way Marco's grip on his rabbit had loosened slightly, the way his breathing had started to even out. "Sometimes you're crying because you're scared, and that's okay." The safe house felt like a prison wrapped in luxury. 3 days had passed since the security briefing in Dante's office, and Eleanor found herself confined to the estate grounds with Marco while armed men patrolled the perimeter like restless wolves. The normalcy she'd grown to cherish, weekend shifts at Nonna's, casual trips to the park, grocery runs with Marco chattering in the back seat, had evaporated overnight, replaced by the suffocating reality of living under siege. Marco sensed the change, though he couldn't articulate it. He clung closer to Elena during the day, asked more questions about when they could go places, and his nightmares had returned with a vengeance. Twice in the past week, Elena had woken to find him standing beside her bed, clutching Coniglio and trembling from dreams about bad men taking away everyone he loved. "Why can't we go to the library today?" Marco asked for the 3rd time over breakfast. His small face creased with confusion. "You promised we'd get new books about dragons." Elena exchanged a glance with Mrs. Chen, who was bustling around the kitchen with more energy than usual, a sure sign that she was worried and channeling anxiety into productivity. "The library will still be there next week, sweetheart," Elena said gently. "Sometimes we need to stay home and find adventures here instead." "But I'm tired of here," Marco said, with the honest frustration of a 6-year-old who didn't understand why his world had suddenly shrunk to the confines of even the most beautiful home. "I want to see other places. I want to show Cornelio the ducks at the pond." Elena's heart broke a little more. In trying to protect Marco, they were inadvertently creating the very thing Isabella's death had caused. A world where love felt dangerous, where caring about people meant losing freedom. "Tell you what," Elena said, making a decision that would probably earn her a lecture from Dante about security protocols. "After lunch we'll set up a picnic in the garden, we'll pretend we're camping in the mountains and tell stories about dragons who live in caves made of roses." Marco's face brightened immediately. "Really? With real food and everything?" "Real food and everything," Elena confirmed, already mentally planning how to turn the gazebo into an adequate fort while staying within sight of the security cameras she'd learned to identify. Mrs. Chen touched Elena's shoulder as she passed, a silent gesture of approval that meant more than words. An hour later, Elena was spreading blankets in the garden when she heard the rumble of multiple cars approaching the main gate. Through the wrought iron, she could see a convoy of black SUVs that looked more like military vehicles than civilian transportation. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the organized precision of a security detail designed to protect someone extremely important or extremely dangerous. "Elena!" Marco called from where he was arranging Coniglio's travelling supplies. "Is Papa coming home early?" "I think so, sweetheart," Elena replied, though something about the approaching vehicles made her skin prickle with unease. Dante typically travelled with Vincent and maybe one additional security car. This looked like enough firepower to invade a small country. The front door opened with more force than usual, and Elena heard the rapid footsteps of multiple people entering the house. Through the garden doors, she caught glimpses of men in dark suits moving through the downstairs rooms with the efficient urgency of a crisis response team. "Mrs. Chen," Dante's voice carried from the foyer, edged with something Elena had never heard before, not anger exactly, but something closer to barely controlled rage. "Where are Elena and Marco?" Elena felt ice form in her stomach. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. "In the garden, Mr. Dante," Mrs. Chen replied. "They're having a picnic." "Get them inside, now." Elena was already moving, scooping up Marco with one arm and Coniglio with the other, while her mind raced through possibilities. Had Torino made a move? Had someone breached the estate's security? Had something happened to Sarah or one of the other people from Elena's past? "But the picnic," Marco started to protest. "Later, baby," Elena said, carrying him toward the house with quick steps that she tried to keep from looking like the retreat they actually were. "Papa needs to see us right now." They found Dante in his study, surrounded by more men than Elena had ever seen in the house at once. His usually immaculate suit jacket was discarded, his sleeves rolled up, and there was something in his posture that reminded Elena of a predator preparing to strike. The multiple screens on his desk displayed what looked like surveillance footage, maps, and documents she couldn't read from across the room. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Papa?" Marco's voice was small, confused by the serious faces surrounding them. Dante's expression immediately softened as he focused on his son, but Eleanor could see the effort it cost him to project calm. "Come here, Marco. I need to tell you something important." Eleanor set Marco down, but kept her hands on his shoulders as he approached his father's desk. Every instinct she'd developed for reading dangerous situations was screaming that they were in immediate peril, though she couldn't identify the specific threat. "Marco," Dante said, his voice gentle despite the steel underneath. "We're going to take a little trip tonight, just for a few days, like a camping adventure." "Where?" Marco asked, his child's intuition picking up on the undercurrents of tension that the adults were trying to hide. "Somewhere safe and fun," Dante replied, which wasn't really an answer at all. "Eleanor and Mrs. Chen will come with us, and we'll have a great time." Elena felt her chest tighten. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough that Dante was evacuating his own home. Places that had felt like fortresses apparently weren't fortress enough. "Is it because of the bad men?" Marco asked, with the devastating directness of childhood. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena watched Dante struggle with how much truth a 6-year-old could handle, how much honesty was protective versus traumatic. "Sometimes," Dante said finally, "families have to be extra careful about staying safe. That's what we're doing, being extra careful." Marco nodded with the acceptance of a child who trusted his father completely, but Elena could see the questions forming behind his eyes. Questions about why being careful looked so much like being afraid. One of the men flanking Dante's desk leaned close to whisper something that made Dante's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Elena caught fragments. Intercepted communications. Timeline moved up. No choice but to relocate immediately. "Elena," Dante said, his eyes meeting hers across the room with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I need to speak with you privately. Marco, why don't you help Mrs. Chen pack Cornelio's travel bag? Make sure he has everything he needs for an adventure." After Marco left with obvious reluctance, the atmosphere in the room shifted into something more dangerous. Elena found herself facing a collection of men whose expressions had hardened into professional assessment, and she realised that her comfortable role as Marco's caregiver was about to be tested in ways she'd never imagined. "Sit," Dante said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Elena remained standing. "Tell me what's happening." "Torino intercepted intelligence about your background that we'd hoped to keep contained," one of the bodyguards said bluntly. "Specifically, information about your foster father who was a police officer." Elena's blood turned cold. "Officer Martinez? He died 3 years ago. What does he have to do with anything?" Torino's people discovered that Martinez trained you in basic security protocols, Dante said grimly. Self-defense, threat assessment, situational awareness, skills that make you more valuable as an asset and more dangerous as a potential witness. Elena stared at him, trying to process the implications. Officer Martinez had indeed taught her to defend herself after a particularly bad foster placement, had shown her how to read dangerous situations and plan escape routes. She thought of those lessons as survival skills for navigating an unpredictable world, not intelligence training. Torino now believes, Dante continued, that you're not just Marco's caregiver, but a trained operative that I've placed in my household for strategic reasons. He thinks our relationship is more than personal. But it's not! Elena started to protest, then stopped. Because wasn't it? Hadn't her feelings for both Marco and Dante evolved far beyond professional boundaries? Hadn't she chosen to stay and fight for this family rather than run to safety? Isn't it? Dante asked quietly, echoing her own thoughts. Elena, what we've built here, what Marco has come to depend on, what I've... He stopped, seeming to wrestle with words that carried too much weight. This stopped being just about Marco's care weeks ago. The admission hung between them, like a bridge finally built across a chasm that had been separating them since her first night in the house. So what happens now? Elena asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Now Torino forces our hand, Dante replied. He's planning something that will require us to respond, and he's counting on using you and Marco as leverage to control that response. Elena felt sick. The safe house. You're moving us to keep us out of his reach. Among other things. Dante's smile was sharp as a blade, filled with deadly promise. But mainly, I'm moving you to keep you safe while I handle Vincent Torino permanently. The word sent a chill down Elena's spine. She understood exactly what handle permanently meant in Dante's world, and while part of her was horrified by the violence implicit in that phrase, another part, the part that loved Marco with fierce maternal instinct, felt savage satisfaction that someone would finally make Torino pay for threatening a child. How long? Elena asked. 3 days, maybe 4, just long enough to eliminate the threat and secure our territory. Elena nodded, trying to process the reality that she was now part of a world where threats were eliminated rather than simply managed. And after? When it's over? Dante's green eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. After, he said quietly, we come home, all of us, and we build the life we've been pretending to live. Elena stared at him, struck by the weight of what he was offering. Not just safety or financial security, but genuine partnership in building something permanent and precious. A family born not from obligation or convenience, but from choice and commitment and the willingness to fight for what mattered. Elena, Dante continued, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it, when this is over, when Torino is no longer a threat to the people I love, I want to have a conversation about what comes next, about what this family could become if you're willing to make it real. Elena's breath caught. She could read between the lines of what he was saying, could see the future he was sketching in careful, hopeful strokes. A future where she wasn't just Marco's caregiver, but his mother in every way that mattered. Where she and Dante were partners in building something beautiful from the ashes of loss and the foundation of unexpected love. Yes, Elena said simply, the word carrying all the hope and fear and desperate longing she'd been afraid to voice. When this is over, we'll have that conversation. Dante's smile was the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him since the security briefing began. Then let's go keep our son safe so we can come home and build the life he deserves. As they prepared to leave the house that had become her first real home, Eleanor realised that she was no longer running from her future or settling for survival. She was fighting for love, and for the first time in her life, she believed she might actually win. 6 months later, autumn had given way to spring, and Eleanor Rodriguez Moretti stood in the same garden where she'd first helped Marco build a fort for Cornelio, watching her son, because that's what he was now, legally and in every way that mattered, chase butterflies with the kind of uninhibited joy she'd once thought was lost forever. The transformation was breathtaking. Marco's laughter rang across the manicured grounds as he called to her, "Mama Elena, look! The yellow one is following me!" His dark hair caught the afternoon sun, and his green eyes, so like his father's, sparkled with the kind of confidence that came from knowing he was loved without condition. Elena's chest swelled with pride and wonder. The terrified, grief-stricken child who'd cried in a restaurant 6 months ago had blossomed into this brilliant, secure little boy who called her Mama without hesitation and slept through the night without nightmares. "I see him, sweetheart," Elena called back, adjusting the diamond on her left hand that still felt surreal after 3 months of wearing it. "Maybe he thinks you're another flower." Marco giggled, spinning in circles to test this theory, while Cornelio watched approvingly from his place of honour on a garden bench. The rabbit had gained some new patches over the winter months, but remained Marco's most trusted confidant and Elena's co-conspirator in the daily work of raising a remarkable child. "Mrs. Moretti." Vincent's voice came from behind her, warm with the kind of respect that had replaced his initial wariness months ago. "Your husband is looking for you. He's in his study with the final preparations." Elena smiled at the title that still made her pulse quicken with happiness. Mrs. Moretti. After 28 years of being nobody's anything, she was now somebody's wife, somebody's mother, somebody's anchor in a world that had transformed from dangerous to beautiful overnight. Well, not quite overnight. The path from that terrible week in the safe house to this moment had been marked with challenges, revelations, and the kind of healing that required patience and forgiveness in equal measure. The confrontation with Torino had ended exactly as Dante promised, permanently. Elena had never asked for details, and Dante had never offered them. Some knowledge was too dangerous for civilian minds, even civilian minds that had chosen to love dangerous men. What mattered was that the threat had been eliminated, their family had remained safe, and the future they'd imagined during those terrifying days had become reality. "Tell him I'll be right there," Elena said, then called to Marco. 5 more minutes with the butterflies, then we need to get ready for dinner." "Is Papa cooking tonight?" Marco asked hopefully. Over the winter months, Dante had taken cooking lessons from Mrs. Chen, determined to master at least 3 dishes that would meet his son's exacting standards for real food. His lasagna was now legendary in the household, though his attempts at pancakes remained questionable at best. "Papa is cooking," Elena confirmed, "but Mrs. Chen is supervising, so it should actually be edible." Marco's delighted laughter followed her as she walked toward the house, her steps light despite the weight of responsibility she now carried. Being Dante Moretti's wife meant more than simply loving him and Marco. It meant taking her place in a world where her opinions mattered, where her voice carried influence, where her protective instincts had found their perfect outlet. She'd established a grief counselling program for children that served 3 counties, funded by the Moretti Family Foundation. She'd completed her nursing degree through a combination of private tutoring and online courses, graduating summa cum laude while balancing motherhood and marriage. She'd even learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of the family business, earning respect from men who'd initially seen her as Dante's weakness rather than his strength. Elena found Dante in his study, reviewing documents that looked suspiciously like architectural plans rather than business contracts. He wore charcoal slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the same kind of casual elegance that had first caught her attention in Nonna's family restaurant. But everything else had changed. The wariness had been replaced by contentment, the careful control by genuine ease. He looked like a man who'd found his place in the world and intended to defend it. "Planning something?" Elena asked, settling into the chair across from his desk that had become hers by unspoken agreement. Dante looked up with the kind of smile that still made her pulse quicken after 6 months of marriage. Always, "Come look at this." He turned the plans toward her, and Elena's breath caught. They were blueprints for a house, not a mansion like some of Dante's associates preferred, but a warm, family-sized home with wide porches and bay windows and enough bedrooms for the children they'd talked about having someday. "It's beautiful," Elena said softly, tracing the lines of what looked like a perfect kitchen designed for family dinners and homework help. "Where?" 20 minutes north of here. Enough space for Marco to have friends over, close enough to the city for business, far enough away for real privacy. Dante leaned back in his chair, watching her face carefully. "What do you think?" Elena studied the plans more closely, noting the master suite that adjoined a smaller bedroom, clearly designed as a nursery, the library that would hold all of Marco's books and more, the garden space that would let her grow the vegetables she'd dreamed about since childhood. "I think," she said slowly, "that it looks like the kind of house where children grow up feeling safe and loved, where families make memories that last generations." "That's exactly what I was hoping for," Dante said, standing to move around the desk toward her. "Elena, we've been so focused on healing from the past and dealing with immediate challenges that we've never really talked about what we want our future to look like." Elena's heart began to race as she recognized the serious tone that meant important conversations were about to happen. "I know we're happy here," Dante continued, settling on the edge of his desk so he could face her directly. "Marco is thriving. You've built an incredible life for yourself. We've become the family none of us expected, but all of us needed." "But," Elena prompted, though she couldn't imagine what caveat could follow such a perfect assessment, "but this house was built for my old life, for business entertaining and security protocols, and the kind of careful distance that kept everyone safe when safety was never guaranteed." Dante reached for her hands, his touch warm and steady. "I want to build something new, something that's ours from the foundation up, a home where Marco can be loud and messy and completely normal, where you can have the garden you've always wanted, where we can—" He paused, and Eleanor saw something that looked almost like nervousness flicker across his features. "Where we can what?" Eleanor asked gently. "Where we can raise the brothers and sisters Marco keeps asking for," Dante said softly. "Where we can build the kind of family that survives anything because it's built on choice and commitment rather than obligation or convenience." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as the full scope of what he was offering settled over her. Not just a house, but a future. Not just marriage, but partnership in creating something that would outlast both of them. "How many brothers and sisters is Marco requesting?" Elena asked, her voice slightly shaky with emotion. Dante's smile was radiant. "At least 3, preferably 4. He's very specific about wanting both kinds so he can teach them different things." Elena laughed, imagining Marco as the protective big brother he was already becoming in practice. "And what do you want?" "I want whatever makes you happy," Dante said simply. "But if I'm being honest, I want enough children to fill every bedroom in that house with noise and chaos, and the kind of love that makes all the danger worth it." Elena stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of trust implicit in his vision. He wasn't just asking her to have children. He was asking her to help him build a dynasty founded on love rather than fear, to create something beautiful from the ashes of loss and trauma. "Yes," Elena said, the word carrying all the hope and certainty and desperate joy she'd learned to embrace. "Yes to the house, yes to the children, yes to building something that belongs completely to us." Dante's kiss was her reward, tender and desperate and full of promise. When they broke apart, Eleanor could see tears in his green eyes that matched her own. "I love you," Dante said softly, the words he'd been saying every morning and every night for months, but which still felt like miracles each time she heard them. "I love you too," Elena replied, meaning it with every cell of her body. "All of you, this whole impossible, wonderful family we've built." They were interrupted by Marco's voice calling from the garden, urgent with 6-year-old drama. "Mama Elena! Papa! The butterfly is stuck in Mrs. Chen's tomatoes and Cornelio thinks we should rescue it." Elena and Dante looked at each other and burst into laughter, the kind that came from pure happiness rather than humour. "Crisis management calls," Elena said, standing and smoothing her dress. "The most important kind," Dante agreed, taking her hand as they walked toward the garden together. Through the windows, Elena could see Marco orchestrating what appeared to be an elaborate butterfly rescue operation with Mrs. Chen's patient assistance. Cornelio supervised from his position of authority on the garden bench, and Vincent stood nearby with the kind of indulgent attention that suggested even former bodyguards weren't immune to 6-year-old charm. This was her life now. Not perfect, certainly. There were still challenges that came with loving a man whose business occasionally required difficult decisions, still moments when the past tried to whisper that she didn't deserve such happiness. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it was everything she'd dreamed about during those long nights in foster care when she'd imagined what a family might feel like. As they stepped into the garden together, Elena heard Marco's delighted squeal as the butterfly finally freed itself from the tomato plants and soared into the afternoon sky. "See?" Marco called to them, his face bright with triumph. "Cornelio said if we were patient and gentle, everything would work out perfectly." Elena squeezed Dante's hand, thinking that Cornelio was the wisest rabbit in the world. Sometimes patience and gentleness were exactly what broken things needed to become beautiful. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, love really was enough to heal everything. The wedding was everything Elena had never dared to dream about, and nothing like what the world expected from a Moretti family celebration. Instead of the ostentatious display that marked most unions in Dante's world, they chose the garden where their love had first taken root. White roses climbed the gazebo, where Marco had once built forts for Cornelio, and the same autumn light that had witnessed their first conversation now blessed their vows with golden warmth. Elena wore her grandmother's pearls, a gift from Mrs. Chen, who had somehow tracked down the jewellery through Eleanor's old case files, and a dress that was elegant rather than extravagant. Dante stood beside her in a charcoal suit that echoed the one he'd worn to Nonna's 6 months ago, but everything about him radiated joy instead of control. Marco served as ring-bearer with the gravity of someone entrusted with the crown jewels, Cornelio tucked securely in his jacket pocket for moral support. When the moment came to exchange rings, Marco whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Now you're really my mama forever, right?" Elena's voice caught as she promised, "Forever and always, sweetheart, that's what families do." The ceremony was attended by people Elena had come to love, Mrs. Chen wiping happy tears with her handkerchief, Vincent standing proud as an honorary uncle, Rosa from Nonna's restaurant dabbing at her eyes with a kitchen towel. But it was the absence of violence, the presence of choice, the celebration of healing that made the moment perfect. When Dante kissed his bride, Marco cheered loud enough to startle the roses, and Eleanor tasted salt on her lips that might have been tears or laughter or both. "Ladies and gentlemen," the officiant announced with a smile, "I present Mr. and Mrs. Moretti and their son Marco." Their son. Not stepson, not ward, not the complicated terminology that marked blended families. Their son, chosen and claimed and loved beyond measure. The reception was held on the terrace overlooking the garden, with tables arranged to encourage conversation rather than hierarchy. Elena moved through the celebration like she belonged there, because she did belong, had earned her place through love and courage and the willingness to fight for what mattered. "Beautiful wedding," said Maria Sant'Angelo, the wife of one of Dante's oldest associates. "You've brought something special to our community, Elena. The children's counselling programme you established. My nephew has been attending since his father's accident. You saved that boy." Elena accepted the praise with grace, understanding that her work had become part of her identity in this world, not just Dante's wife or Marco's mother, but Elena Moretti, advocate for broken children and keeper of other people's healing. "Thank you," Elena said simply. Helping children heal helps all of us heal. The evening progressed with speeches that were heartfelt rather than political, dancing that included children spinning dizzy on the makeshift floor, and the kind of laughter that came from genuine happiness rather than obligation. Elena found herself on the edge of the celebration as the sun set, watching Marco demonstrate his latest magic tricks to a captivated audience of adults who'd forgotten how to be amazed by simple joy. "Penny for your thoughts," Dante said, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of champagne and the easy grace of a man completely at home in his skin. "Just thinking about how far we've all come," Elena replied, accepting the glass but not drinking. There were reasons she'd been avoiding alcohol lately, reasons that made her pulse quicken with hope and nervousness in equal measure. Dante studied her face with the intensity that had first made her nervous and now made her feel cherished. "Everything all right?" Elena looked across the terrace at their son, who was now teaching Mrs. Chen how to make Coniglio disappear and reappear with dramatic flair. At the friends who'd become family, the community that had embraced her completely, the life she'd built from the ashes of everything she'd lost. "Everything is perfect," she said softly, "but it's about to get even better." She set down her champagne glass and reached into her small purse, withdrawing an envelope that she'd been carrying all evening, waiting for the right moment. "What's this?" Dante asked, accepting the envelope with curious eyes. "Your wedding gift," Elena said, her heart hammering as he opened it to reveal a single photograph. Dante stared at the ultrasound image for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, pure wonder. "Elena," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Are you—" "8 weeks," Elena confirmed, laughing at the stunned joy spreading across his features. "I found out yesterday. I wanted to wait until we were officially married to tell you." Dante's hands shook slightly as he held the photograph, studying the tiny shape that would become their child in 7 months. When he looked up at Elena, there were tears streaming down his face. "Marco's going to have a brother or sister," he said, the words carrying wonder and gratitude and overwhelming love. "He already knows," Elena admitted. "I had to tell him when he asked why I wasn't eating the shrimp appetizers. He's been keeping the secret for 2 days." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Marco appeared beside them, Coniglio clutched in one hand and a piece of wedding cake in the other. "Did you tell Papa about the baby?" Marco asked with the barely contained excitement of a 6-year-old who'd been entrusted with the most important secret in the world. Dante crouched down to Marco's level, still clutching the ultrasound photo like a lifeline. "You knew?" "Mama Elena told me I was going to be a big brother," Marco said proudly. "I'm going to teach the baby everything important. How to take care of rabbits, how to build the best forts, and how to make Papa smile when he's worried about business." Dante pulled both Elena and Marco into a fierce embrace, the 3 of them holding each other as the celebration continued around them, their family complete and expanding simultaneously. "I love you," Dante whispered against Elena's hair. "Both of you, all of you." Elena closed her eyes, surrounded by the warmth of her husband's arms and the solid presence of her son, carrying the promise of new life and infinite possibility. This was what happiness felt like. Not the desperate relief of survival or the temporary pleasure of good fortune, but the deep, abiding joy that came from being exactly where you belonged with exactly the people who needed you most. 3 hours later, as guests departed with full hearts and promises to visit soon, Elena found herself in the garden with Marco, who was carefully tucking Coniglio into his travelling bag for the journey upstairs. "Mama Elena," Marco said seriously, "Coniglio has a very important question." "What's that, sweetheart?" "He wants to know if the new baby will love rabbits as much as we do." Elena smiled, thinking of the child growing inside her who would inherit Marco's capacity for wonder, Dante's strength, and her own fierce protection of innocent things. "I think," Elena said, crouching down to Marco's level, that this baby is going to be very lucky to have a big brother who knows all about taking care of the things we love. Marco nodded solemnly. Cornelio agrees. He says babies need lots of practice before they're ready for their own rabbits. Elena kissed the top of Marco's head, breathing in the scent of cake and childhood and perfect trust. Then it's a good thing you and Cornelio will be here to teach them. As they walked back toward the house together, Elena caught sight of Dante watching them from the terrace, his expression soft with the kind of contentment that came from having everything you'd ever wanted and the wisdom to recognize it. The little girl who'd aged out of foster care with nothing but a bus ticket and a fierce determination to survive could never have imagined this ending. Marriage to a man who loved her completely, motherhood to a child who chose to call her Mama, and another baby on the way who would be born into security and surrounded by love from the first breath. Elena Moretti walked into her future with her head held high, her son's hand in hers, and her heart full of the kind of hope that transforms everything it touches. She'd started as nobody's anything and become somebody's everything. And sometimes that was exactly the miracle the world needed. The silence that followed Elena's words was heavy, suffocating, filled with the weight of recognition that neither adult wanted to acknowledge. Marco's breathing had steadied, his death grip on Cornelio loosening as he watched Elena with the cautious hope of a child who had learned not to expect comfort but couldn't help wanting it anyway. Across the restaurant, Elena could feel the collective tension of other diners who had stopped pretending to eat their meals and were now openly staring at their table. The elderly couple at table 6 whispered behind their menus, their disapproval palpable. A businessman at table 9 checked his watch with obvious irritation, clearly debating whether to ask for his check early rather than endure more disruption. "Excuse me." The voice belonged to Marcus, Nonna's night manager, who materialised beside their table with the practised smile of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. He was a thin man in his 50s, greying at the temples, with the kind of nervous energy that came from 20 years of restaurant management. "I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have a lovely private dining room available if you prefer somewhere more quiet for your family." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Elena watched Dante's face transform, saw the exact moment his expression shifted from desperate father to something infinitely more dangerous. His green eyes went cold as winter stone, and when he looked up at Marcus, the manager actually took a half-step backward. "Are you asking us to leave?" Dante's voice was quiet, controlled, but there was something underneath it that made Eleanor's skin prickle with awareness. This wasn't just a wealthy customer being offended. This was a predator being challenged in his territory. Marcus's smile became strained. "Oh, no, sir, not at all. We simply thought you might be more comfortable." "My son and I are perfectly comfortable here." Each word was delivered with surgical precision, cutting through Marcus's explanation like a blade. "Unless you're telling me that a crying child is somehow against restaurant policy." No, sir, of course not. Children are always welcome at Nonna's. It's just that some of our other guests have mentioned—" "Then perhaps," Dante said, his tone dropping even lower, "you should focus on managing your other guests' expectations rather than attempting to relocate paying customers who have done nothing wrong." Elena felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She'd seen this kind of quiet menace before, in the foster homes where she'd learned to read danger in the space between words. But watching Dante defend his son's right to exist in public, to be a grieving child without apology, she felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Respect. Marcus mumbled something about understanding completely and retreated with visible relief, leaving the three of them alone again. But the damage was done. Marco had tensed up during the exchange, his tears threatening to start fresh as he registered the tension between the adults. "Hey," Elena said softly, drawing Marco's attention back to her. "Cornelio looks tired. Has he had dinner yet?" Marco shook his head, clutching the rabbit closer to his chest. "Well, that's a problem," Elena said seriously. "Rabbits need their dinner, especially brave rabbits who take care of little boys. What do you think he'd like to eat?" It was a ridiculous question. The stuffed rabbit was clearly old and well-loved, its fabric worn thin from years of handling. But Marco considered it with the gravity of someone being asked to solve a complex mathematical equation. "Carrots," he whispered. "Carrots are excellent rabbit food," Elena agreed. "But I bet Cornelio might also like some warm milk. My rabbit, when I was little, his name was Patches, he loved warm milk before bedtime." She was lying, of course. She'd never had a stuffed rabbit, never had anything that belonged just to her during her childhood, bouncing between foster homes. But the lie came easily, wrapped in the kind of gentle fiction that helped children feel less alone in the world. Marco's eyes widened slightly. "You had a rabbit too?" "I did. He was grey and white with one brown ear. And when I was sad, Patches always knew exactly what to do to make me feel better." Elena glanced up at Dante, noting the way he was studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. His earlier hostility had been replaced by something more complex, wariness mixed with curiosity, as if he couldn't decide whether she was a threat or an opportunity. "What did Patches do?" Marco asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well," Elena said, settling more comfortably into her crouch beside the table, "Patches had a very important job. Whenever I felt scared or sad, he would listen to all my worries, and then, when I was done telling him everything that hurt, he would whisper back the most important secret in the world." Marco leaned forward despite himself, drawn in by the promise of a secret. Even Dante's attention had sharpened, though he remained silent. "What secret?" Marco breathed. Elena smiled, the expression transforming her tired features into something almost radiant. "That feeling scared doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. And being human means you get to feel all the feelings, the sad ones and the happy ones and the angry ones, and that's what makes life worth living." She paused, watching Marco process this revelation. "The secret," Elena continued, "is that brave people aren't the ones who never get scared. Brave people are the ones who feel scared and do what needs to be done anyway, just like you did tonight." "I'm not brave," Marco whispered, tears threatening again. "Oh, but you are," Elena said firmly. "You came to dinner with your papa even though the restaurant is full of strangers. You held Coniglio tight when you felt scared instead of hitting or running away. And you listened when I talked to you, even though you don't know me. That's incredibly brave." She looked up at Dante again, noting the way his jaw had tightened during her impromptu speech about courage. There was something raw in his expression, as if her words had found a target she hadn't intended. "I think," Elena said carefully, "that both you and Cornelio have been very brave for a very long time. But even the bravest rabbits and the bravest little boys need to eat dinner and drink warm milk so they can grow big and strong." Marco considered this solemnly. "Papa ordered food," he said, glancing at his father, "but I don't feel hungry." "That's okay," Elena said. "Sometimes when we're sad, our stomachs forget how to feel hungry, but our bodies still need food to work properly, just like cars need gas." She gestured toward the kitchen. "How about I go get Coniglio some special rabbit food, maybe some warm milk and a little piece of cinnamon toast cut into a carrot shape. And while Coniglio eats his dinner, you can tell me about your favourite things. Deal?" For the first time since she'd approached their table, Marco's face brightened with something resembling genuine interest. "Okay." Elena stood, her knees protesting after crouching for so long. As she straightened, she found herself at eye level with Dante, who was studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than simple gratitude. "He's a good boy," Elena replied. "He just needs someone to see that he's hurting instead of assuming he's causing trouble." Something flickered across Dante's features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "And you see that because—" Elena hesitated, aware that she was treading into dangerous territory, sharing too much of her own story, revealing too much about the experiences that had taught her to recognize a child's silent cry for help. "Because," she said finally, "I was Marco's age once, and I remember what it felt like to cry and have adults treat it like a problem to be solved instead of a feeling to be understood." The admission hung between them, more intimate than she'd intended. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, suddenly aware that she'd revealed far more than was appropriate for a server talking to a customer. But Dante's expression didn't change to judgment or dismissal. Instead, his green eyes softened with something that looked almost like understanding. "How long will you be working tonight?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested the question was more significant than casual curiosity. Eleanor glanced toward the kitchen, calculating the remainder of her shift. "Another 3 hours at least. We're short-staffed and I've got side work to finish." Dante nodded slowly. "Then perhaps," he said, "you could join us for a few minutes when you bring Marco's carrot toast, if you have time." It wasn't really a request. There was too much authority in his voice, too much expectation in his posture. But there was also something else, a vulnerability he was trying to hide behind polite phrasing and careful distance. He needed her help, not just wanted it, but genuinely needed it. And Elena, who had spent her entire adult life being needed by no one, felt something dangerous and hopeful unfurl in her chest. "I'll be right back," she said, and headed toward the kitchen to prepare a meal for a stuffed rabbit and the broken little boy who loved him. The kitchen at Nonna's was a symphony of controlled chaos, steam rising from industrial pots while line cooks moved with practiced efficiency around the cramped space. Elena navigated through the familiar maze of stainless steel and rushing bodies, her mind focused on the unusual request she was about to fulfill. "What's with the special order?" asked Rosa, the head cook, as Elena warmed milk in a small saucepan. Rosa was a sturdy woman in her 50s, with greying hair tucked under a hairnet, and kind eyes that had watched Elena struggle through countless double shifts over the past 2 years. "Table 12, Elena said simply, cutting a piece of cinnamon toast into the shape of a carrot with more care than the task probably warranted. "The little boy needs something special." Rosa glanced through the kitchen's pass-through window toward the dining room, where Dante and Marco sat in tense silence. "That's some expensive trouble out there, mija. You sure you want to get involved?" Elena paused, the knife halfway through the toast. It was a fair question. Everything about Dante Moretti screamed danger, from his perfectly tailored suit to the way he commanded attention without saying a word. Smart people probably kept their distance from men like him. But then she remembered the helpless expression on his face as he watched his son cry, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he tried to comfort Marco. Powerful or not, dangerous or not, he was a father drowning in his own inadequacy. "He's just a little boy who's hurting," Elena said finally, arranging the carrot-shaped toast on a child-sized plate. "I can't fix whatever's broken in their world, but I can make sure he eats something." Rosa studied her with the knowing expression of someone who'd raised 5 children of her own. "You got that look again." "What look?" "The same one you get when you see kids in the dining room who remind you of yourself. That protective mama bear look that's going to get you in trouble someday." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't." Rosa's smile was gentle but pointed. "Just be careful, Elena. Rich men like that don't usually have simple problems, and their solutions tend to be complicated." Elena nodded, accepting the wisdom even as she dismissed the warning. She arranged the warm milk and toast on a small tray, adding a cloth napkin and a plastic spoon that looked appropriately child-sized. When she returned to table 12, she found Marco exactly as she'd left him, clutching Coniglio against his chest, his green eyes red-rimmed but no longer actively crying. Dante sat beside him with the rigid posture of someone holding himself together through sheer force of will. "Special delivery for Coniglio," Elena announced softly, setting the tray down in front of Marco. Warm milk and carrot toast, cut just the right size for rabbit mouths. Marco's eyes widened as he took in the carefully prepared meal. The toast was golden brown, shaped like a perfect carrot with delicate scoring to suggest texture. The milk steamed gently in a small white mug, with a tiny dollop of honey swirled on top. "You really made it look like a carrot," Marco whispered, wonder evident in his voice. "Of course I did," Elena said, sliding into the empty chair across from them without asking permission. "Cornelio is a very important guest. He deserves proper rabbit food." She noticed Dante's slight intake of breath as she sat down, but he didn't object. Instead, he watched with intense focus as Eleanor guided Marco through the process of pretending to feed his stuffed rabbit. "Cornelio says thank you," Marco murmured, touching the toast to the rabbit's mouth before taking a small bite himself. "You're welcome, Cornelio," Elena replied seriously. "How does it taste?" Marco chewed thoughtfully. "Good. Sweet. The honey makes it special," Elena explained. "My foster mum used to put honey in warm milk when I had nightmares. She said it helped chase the scary thoughts away." The words slipped out before she could stop them, more personal than she'd intended. But something about Marco's quiet acceptance, the way he listened without judgment, made the truth feel safe. Dante's attention sharpened. "Foster mum?" Elena hesitated, aware that she was venturing into territory she usually kept carefully guarded. But Marco was watching her with the kind of intense focus children reserve for adults who treated them like actual people, and she found herself unable to retreat behind polite deflection. "I lived with different families when I was growing up," she said carefully. "Some were better than others, but Mrs. Patterson, she was one of the good ones. She understood that sometimes kids cry not because they want something, but because they're scared." "What were you scared of?" Marco asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena felt her chest tighten. The honest answer was everything. Being moved again, being separated from the few belongings she'd managed to keep, never being good enough to earn a permanent place anywhere. But 6-year-old boys didn't need to carry the weight of an adult's fears. "I was scared that I didn't belong anywhere," she said instead, "that I was too much trouble or not interesting enough, or that I'd do something wrong and have to leave." Marco nodded with the gravity of someone who understood that particular fear intimately. "Mama died in a car accident," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Papa says it wasn't anyone's fault, but I think maybe it was mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena felt her heart break for this little boy who carried guilt too heavy for his small shoulders. Across the table Dante went rigid, his face pale with the kind of shock that came from hearing your child voice, fears you'd hoped they didn't carry. "Oh, sweetheart," Elena said softly, reaching across the table to cover Marco's small hand with hers. "It wasn't your fault. Accidents happen because the world is unpredictable, not because little boys think or do anything wrong." "But I was crying that morning," Marco continued, tears threatening again. "Mama was rushing because I couldn't find Cornelio, and I wouldn't get in the car without him. She was driving fast because of me." Dante's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Marco, son, we've talked about this." "He needs to say it," Eleanor interrupted gently, keeping her eyes on Marco while addressing his father. "He needs someone to hear it so he can let it go." She squeezed Marco's hand gently. "Your mama was rushing because she loved you, because she knew Cornelio was important to you, and she wanted to make sure you felt safe and happy. That's what good mamas do. They take care of the things that matter to their children." Marco's lower lip trembled. "But if I hadn't cried—" "Then you would have been a different little boy than the one your mama loved," Elena said firmly. "She loved you exactly as you are, including the parts that worry and need comfort and cry when things feel scary. Crying doesn't make you bad, Marco. It makes you human." She glanced at Dante, noting the way his hands had clenched into fists on the table. There was grief written in every line of his posture, but also something that looked like gratitude mixed with desperation. Sometimes, Elena continued, when people we love die, we try to carry all the guilt and sadness by ourselves. We think that if we can just figure out what we did wrong, we can somehow make it better. But grief doesn't work that way. How does it work? Marco asked, his voice small but steady. Elena considered the question seriously. How did you explain the mechanics of loss to someone who was just beginning to understand that the world could take away everything you loved without warning? Grief is like carrying a very heavy backpack, she said finally. At first it feels impossible to move with all that weight, but slowly, as you get stronger, the backpack starts to feel lighter, not because the love you carried for your mama got smaller, but because you got bigger, strong enough to carry love and sadness at the same time. Marco absorbed this with the solemnity of a child processing profound truth. Will Papa's backpack get lighter too? Elena looked across the table at Dante, who was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pain, certainly. Recognition, maybe. And underneath it all, something that looked almost like hope. Your papa loves you and your mama very much, Elena said carefully. Sometimes adults think they have to carry their heavy backpacks alone to protect the people they love. But sharing the weight makes everyone stronger. Is that why he doesn't cry? Marco asked. Because he's protecting me? The question hit its target with devastating accuracy. Elena watched Dante's composure crack for just a moment, saw the raw grief he'd been hiding behind controlled strength and perfect suits. Maybe, Elena said softly, but you know what I learned in foster care? The bravest thing you can do is let people see when you're hurting, because that's how they know you need them. She looked directly at Dante as she spoke, hoping he could hear the message beneath her words. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to carry everything alone. Your son needs to see that it's okay to grieve. Marco took another bite of his carrot toast, chewing thoughtfully. Coniglio thinks you're nice, he said eventually. I think Coniglio is very wise, Elena replied, and I think he's lucky to have someone who takes such good care of him. Papa got him for me when Mama went to heaven, Marco explained. He said every boy needs something to hold when the world feels too big. Elena's eyes misted as she glanced at Dante, seeing him through new eyes. This man who commanded such intimidating presence had gone out and bought his grieving son a stuffed rabbit because he understood the power of comfort objects. Your papa sounds very smart, she said. He is, Marco agreed, but he doesn't know how to make warm milk with honey, and he can't braid hair, and sometimes he forgets that kids need different food than grown-ups. Each innocent observation was like a small knife to Dante's composure. Elena could see him struggling with the growing list of ways he felt inadequate as a single father. Those are all things you can learn, Elena said gently, addressing both father and son. And the most important thing, loving someone enough to keep trying even when it's hard. Your papa already knows how to do that. Marco smiled for the first time since she'd approached their table, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Will you teach Papa how to make the honey milk? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Elena wasn't sure she was ready to explore. Teaching Dante to make honey milk meant more contact, more involvement in their lives, more opportunities to care about people whose world was undoubtedly more complicated than she could imagine. But looking at Marco's hopeful face, at Dante's carefully controlled expression that couldn't quite hide his desperation, Elena found herself nodding before common sense could intervene. If he wants to learn, she said carefully, I'd be happy to show him. Dante's green eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. I would, he said quietly, very much like to learn. Eleanor returned with the warm milk ingredients 15 minutes later, carrying a small tray with honey, a saucepan, and measuring spoons. The dining room had quieted as the evening crowd thinned, leaving their corner table feeling more intimate despite the public setting. Marco had finished his carrot toast and was now holding Coniglio in his lap, stroking the rabbit's worn fur with the kind of gentle repetition that suggested comfort rather than nervous energy. His tears had dried completely, replaced by the focused attention of a child watching his world expand in small, significant ways. Dante sat beside his son with marginally less tension than before, though Eleanor noticed his green eyes tracked her movement across the restaurant with the vigilant awareness of someone accustomed to cataloguing potential threats. Even in this moment of vulnerability, he remained fundamentally alert. "Okay," Elena said, settling back into her chair and arranging the supplies on the table. "The secret to perfect honey milk is in the timing. You have to warm the milk slowly so it doesn't scorch and add the honey at exactly the right moment." She demonstrated as she spoke, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to cook in cramped foster home kitchens where every ingredient was precious. "See how I'm heating it on low? Milk is delicate. If you rush it, it gets bitter." Marco leaned forward, fascinated. Mama used to make hot chocolate, but not like this. The mention of his mother came easier this time, without the sharp pain that had marked his earlier confession. Elena took that as a promising sign. "Hot chocolate is wonderful," Elena said, "but honey milk is different. It's gentler, better for when your stomach is upset from crying, or when you can't sleep because your thoughts are too loud." She glanced at Dante as she said this, noting how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Something told her that sleepless nights were a familiar struggle in the Moretti household. "Papa doesn't sleep very much," Marco said, with the devastating honesty of children who noticed everything adults tried to hide. "He works in his office all night. Sometimes I hear him walking around." Elena's heart clenched as she imagined Dante pacing through empty rooms, carrying his grief and responsibility in solitude, while his son slept fitfully down the hall. The picture it painted was one of two people drowning separately in the same house. "Sometimes," Elena said carefully, stirring the warming milk, "when we lose someone very important, our brains forget how to turn off. They keep thinking and worrying and planning, even when our bodies need rest." She met Dante's eyes across the table, seeing recognition flash there. The honey milk helps because it tells your body that someone is taking care of you, that for this moment at least you can stop carrying everything by yourself. The milk began to steam gently, and Elena removed it from the portable burner she'd borrowed from the kitchen. "Now comes the important part. Marco, can you help me measure the honey?" Marco nodded eagerly, carefully spooning honey into the measuring spoon with the intense concentration of someone given a crucial task. Elena guided his small hands as he drizzled the golden sweetness into the warm milk, praising his precision with the kind of attention that made him glow with pride. "Perfect," Elena said, stirring the mixture until the honey dissolved completely. "Now we let it cool just a little so it's warm but not hot, like a hug from the inside." As they waited, Elena found herself studying Dante more openly. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of exhaustion and worry. His expensive suit couldn't hide the slight weight loss that suggested he'd been forgetting to eat, too focused on managing crisis and responsibility to tend to his own basic needs. "You haven't been taking care of yourself," she said, the observation slipping out before she could filter it through professional politeness. Dante's eyebrows rose slightly. "Excuse me?" Elena felt heat creep up her neck, realizing she'd overstepped the careful boundaries they'd been maintaining. But something about the evening, Marco's vulnerability, Dante's obvious desperation, the strange intimacy of teaching someone to make honey milk at midnight in an empty restaurant, had stripped away her usual caution. "You've lost weight," she said, doubling down instead of retreating. "Your suit is too big in the shoulders, and you have that look people get when they're running on coffee and adrenaline instead of actual food and sleep." For a moment, she thought he might be offended by her presumption. His expression went carefully blank, the kind of neutrality that probably preceded the dismissal of people who forgot their place. Instead, he surprised her by laughing, a short, dry sound devoid of humour. Are you psychoanalyzing all your customers tonight, or am I special? Just the ones whose sons I'm teaching to drink honey milk, Elena replied, with more confidence than she felt. Self-neglect is a luxury you can't afford when you have a child depending on you. The words hung between them, more pointed than she'd intended. But Marco was listening with the absorbed attention of a child hearing adults discuss something important, and Elena realized that her bluntness might be exactly what this family needed. Papa forgets to eat lunch, Marco offered helpfully. Mrs. Chen has to remind him. Mrs. Chen? Elena asked. Our housekeeper, Dante said, his tone suggesting the woman was more family than employee. She's been with us since before Marco was born. Elena nodded, filing away this information. The fact that Dante had kept long-time staff suggested loyalty and possibly kindness beneath his intimidating exterior, but it also confirmed her suspicion that he was struggling to manage even basic self-care while grieving and parenting simultaneously. She tested the milk temperature against her wrist, then poured it into a clean mug. There, perfect honey milk, ready for drinking or sharing with important rabbits. Marco accepted the mug with both hands, inhaling the sweet steam with obvious pleasure. He took a small sip, then offered the mug to Coniglio's mouth before drinking again. It tastes like being safe, he said, with the profound simplicity that only children possessed. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. In her peripheral vision, she saw Dante's composure crack slightly, his hand reaching out to smooth his son's hair with infinite tenderness. That's exactly what it's supposed to taste like, Elena said softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Marco slowly drain the mug while clutching Coniglio with his free hand. The restaurant had emptied almost completely, leaving them in a bubble of warm light surrounded by darkened tables and chairs. He hasn't been this calm in months, Dante said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to suppress. Not since his mother died, Elena finished when he couldn't. Dante nodded, not trusting his voice. Elena studied his profile, noting the way grief had carved new lines around his mouth, the careful control he maintained even in this moment of relative peace. She recognized the signs of someone carrying unbearable weight while pretending it was manageable. You know, she said carefully, grief counsellors always say that children process loss by watching how the adults around them handle it. If you never let Marco see you sad, he learns that sadness is something to hide. If you never let him see you cry, he learns that crying is weakness. Dante's green eyes snapped to hers, sharp with something between gratitude and irritation. Are you suggesting I'm handling this wrong? I'm suggesting, Elena said, with the kind of gentle firmness she perfected in foster care, that maybe Marco needs to see that it's okay to miss his mama, that it's okay to cry when you remember her laugh, or get angry when you can't remember exactly how she smelled, or feel scared about forgetting the sound of her voice. The silence that followed was charged with recognition and resistance in equal measure. He's 6 years old, Dante said finally. He shouldn't have to carry my grief along with his own. He's already carrying it, Elena replied. Children absorb everything, especially pain their parents try to hide. The difference is whether he carries it alone, thinking he has to be strong enough for both of you, or whether he carries it as part of a family that grieves together. Marco looked up from his nearly empty mug, honey coating his upper lip. I dream about Mama sometimes, he said suddenly. She tells me she loves me, but then I wake up and remember she's gone. It makes my chest hurt. Eleanor's heart broke for this little boy, trying to navigate loss that would challenge an adult. But she was also proud of him for voicing something so difficult. Dreams about people we love are gifts, she said gently. Even when they make us sad, it means your heart is keeping all the love you have for your mama safe. Does Papa have dreams about Mama too? Marco asked, looking between the adults with the intuitive understanding that this conversation was about more than just him. Elena looked at Dante, seeing him struggle with the choice between protecting his son from his pain and modelling healthy grief. It was a moment that would shape how this family healed, or whether they healed at all. "Yes," Dante said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I dream about Mama too, and sometimes it hurts so much I don't know how to breathe." The admission hung between them, like a bridge finally built across a chasm that had been separating father and son for months. Marco set down his empty mug and crawled into his father's lap. Cornelio clutched against his chest. "We can be sad together, Papa. Cornelio says it's better that way." Elena watched Dante's arms close around his son, saw the exact moment his carefully maintained composure finally cracked. His shoulders shook with the kind of grief he'd been holding back for months, and Marco simply held on, offering the comfort of shared sorrow. For the first time since she'd approached their table, Elena felt like she was witnessing something private, sacred. She started to stand, to give them space for their reconciliation, but Dante's eyes found hers across the table. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying the weight of everything he couldn't say. Elena nodded, understanding that something fundamental had shifted in this moment. Not just between father and son, but between all three of them. She had become part of their story now, whether that was wise or not. "You're welcome," she said simply, "both of you." Outside, rain began to tap against the restaurant windows, the sound gentle and rhythmic like a lullaby. Inside, a broken family had taken its first tentative steps toward healing, and Elena Rodriguez, invisible waitress, former foster child, keeper of other people's secrets, had somehow become the bridge that made it possible. 3 days passed before Elena saw them again. She'd returned to her regular routine at Nonna's, double shifts that blurred together in a haze of coffee refills and forced smiles, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind replayed fragments of that extraordinary evening. Marco's small voice saying the honey milk tasted like being safe, Dante's carefully controlled composure finally cracking as he held his son, the weight of recognition in his green eyes when he thanked her. Elena had convinced herself it was a one-time encounter, a moment of connection that would fade into memory like so many other brief intersections with strangers' lives. She was good at that, caring intensely for people in crisis, then letting them go when the crisis passed. It was safer that way. But Thursday evening, as rain drummed against the restaurant windows and the dinner crowd began to thin, Marcus appeared at her station with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the nervous energy that had marked all their interactions since the incident with Table 12, "there's a gentleman here requesting your section specifically." Elena's pulse quickened, though she kept her expression neutral. "Oh? Table 12," Marcus continued, confirming her suspicion. "He asked for you by name, said he had a business proposition to discuss." The phrase sent a chill down Elena's spine. In her experience, men like Dante Moretti didn't make social calls to restaurant workers. Business propositions from powerful strangers usually came with strings attached, the kind that could transform a life or destroy it, depending on forces entirely beyond her control. Elena smoothed her apron, checked her reflection in the stainless steel coffee pot, and walked across the dining room with steady steps that belied the nervous energy crackling beneath her skin. Dante sat alone at the same table where she'd first approached him, but everything about the scene felt different now. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months, but he'd removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, making him appear marginally less intimidating. A leather portfolio lay closed beside his water glass, and his green eyes tracked her movement across the room with the focused attention of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "Mr. Moretti," Elena said as she reached the table, proud that her voice remained steady. "Where's Marco?" "At home with Mrs. Chen," Dante replied, gesturing for her to sit. "This conversation requires adult attention." Elena remained standing, suddenly aware that accepting his invitation to sit would cross another invisible line between professional courtesy and personal involvement. "Is everything all right? Is Marco okay?" Something flickered across Dante's features, surprise perhaps or recognition. He's fine, better than fine, actually. He's been asking for you constantly since Tuesday night. Wants to know when the nice lady is coming back to teach him more about taking care of Coniglio. Elena felt warmth bloom in her chest despite her wariness. He's a wonderful boy. Yes, he is. Dante's tone carried layers of meaning she couldn't quite decipher. Please, sit. What I have to discuss will be easier if you're comfortable. Against her better judgment, Elena slid into the chair across from him, noting how the simple action seemed to shift the dynamic between them. Sitting made her feel smaller somehow, more vulnerable, while emphasizing the power differential that his standing invitation tried to obscure. "Coffee?" she offered automatically, falling back on professional habits. "I'm not here as a customer tonight, Elena." The way he said her name, with careful pronunciation and just enough emphasis to suggest familiarity, made her skin prickle with awareness. "I'm here because I have a proposition that could benefit both of us." There it was, the moment when kindness revealed its price tag. Elena folded her hands in her lap, calling on every lesson she'd learned about surviving conversations with people who held all the cards. "I'm listening." Dante opened the leather portfolio, revealing documents she couldn't read from her angle. "I've had you investigated." The words hit like a physical blow, even though she'd half expected them. Men like Dante Moretti didn't form spontaneous attachments to restaurant workers without conducting due diligence. Still, hearing it stated so matter-of-factly felt like a violation. "I see," Elena said, proud that her voice remained level. Elena Rodriguez, 28 years old, born in San Antonio to Maria Elena Rodriguez, deceased, father unknown. Entered foster care at age 3 following your mother's death from complications related to drug addiction. Dante's tone was clinical but not unkind. He was stating facts, not passing judgment. Elena's jaw tightened. "Is there a point to this recitation of my life history?" "You aged out of the system at 18 with a partial scholarship to nursing school," Dante continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "Excellent grades until your sophomore year, when you withdrew due to financial constraints. Multiple jobs since then, all in service industries, no criminal record. References describe you as reliable, kind, and excellent with children." He paused, his green eyes meeting hers with an intensity that suggested he saw more than just the facts contained in whatever report lay before him. "You volunteer at Sacred Heart Children's Centre every Saturday, working with kids who've experienced trauma, unpaid position. You've been doing it for 3 years. Elena's breath caught. She'd never mentioned her volunteer work to anyone at the restaurant, had carefully kept that part of her life separate from her daily survival routine. The fact that he knew about it suggested a level of investigation that went far beyond a simple background check. "You've also," Dante continued, "been late on rent 4 times in the past year, despite working double shifts regularly. Your landlord has initiated eviction proceedings twice, both times withdrawn when you managed to catch up on payments." Heat flooded Elena's cheeks. Having her financial struggles laid bare felt more intimate than physical nakedness. "What do you want, Mr. Moretti?" "I want to offer you a job." Elena blinked, certain she'd misheard. "Excuse me?" Dante leaned forward, his posture shifting from investigator to negotiator. "Marco needs stability. He needs someone who understands trauma, who can help him heal without trying to replace what he's lost. He needs someone who makes him feel safe enough to grieve." "And you think that someone is me?" It wasn't a question. "I know it is. I saw what happened Tuesday night. In 20 minutes, you accomplished what months of therapy and patience couldn't. You gave him permission to be sad, and more importantly, you gave me permission to be human." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed what he was suggesting. "You want to hire me to be... what? Marco's nanny?" "Companion, caregiver, whatever title makes you comfortable." Dante's tone remained businesslike, but there was something underneath it that suggested this conversation was costing him more than he wanted to admit. "Live-in position, your own suite in the house, complete privacy, healthcare coverage, including dental and vision. Salary would be..." He named a figure that made Elena's vision blur momentarily. It was more money than she'd ever imagined earning, more than triple her current income from the restaurant. That's too much, she stammered. It's exactly what the position is worth, Dante corrected. Marco is the most important thing in my world. Keeping him safe and helping him heal is worth any price. Elena stared at him, trying to process the magnitude of what he was offering. Financial security, health care, the ability to afford going back to school, to finish her nursing degree, to build the life she dreamed about since aging out of foster care. But nothing came free, especially not from men who commanded the kind of power that radiated from Dante Moretti like heat from a furnace. "What's the catch?" she asked bluntly. Dante's eyebrows rose slightly. "Direct, I like that." "Answer the question." "The catch," Dante said slowly, "is that my world is complicated. There are people who might try to use anyone close to my family as leverage. Security protocols would need to be followed. Certain discretions would be expected regarding the nature of my business." Elena felt ice forming in her stomach. "What kind of business?" For a long moment, Dante said nothing, clearly weighing how much truth this conversation could bear. Finally, he met her eyes with the kind of steady gaze that suggested he'd made a decision about her trustworthiness. The kind where loyalty is the rarest currency, and betrayal has permanent consequences. The words hung between them like a sword suspended by thread. Elena understood exactly what he wasn't saying, what he couldn't say directly in a public restaurant where conversations might be overheard. Dante Moretti wasn't just a wealthy businessman with a grieving son. He was something far more dangerous, and she was being invited into a world where wrong choices didn't just mean lost jobs, they meant lost lives. "I need time to think," Elena said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Of course." Dante reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card, sliding it across the table toward her. "My direct number. When you're ready to discuss details, call me." Elena picked up the card, noting the expensive paper stock and the simple elegance of the design. Just his name and phone number, no title or company name. Everything about it suggested power that didn't need to advertise itself. "One question," she said, as Dante began gathering his documents. "Yes?" "Why me? You could hire anyone, trained professionals, people with degrees and credentials and references from families like yours. Why a foster kid who never finished college?" Dante paused in his packing, his green eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "Because," he said finally, "credentials can't teach someone to recognize a child's silent cry for help. Degrees can't give someone the patience to sit with grief without trying to fix it. And references can't measure whether someone will love my son for who he is, not what he represents." He stood, shrugging into his jacket with fluid grace. "You saw Marco's pain and chose to help, even though it meant risking your job and possibly your safety. You didn't calculate the costs or weigh the benefits, you just acted." Elena remained seated, overwhelmed by the weight of his assessment and the choice he was laying before her. "That kind of instinctive compassion," Dante continued, "can't be bought or trained. It can only be recognized and treasured." He placed a $50 bill on the table, payment for a meal he hadn't ordered, and service that went far beyond anything Nonna's typically provided. "Take all the time you need to decide," he said, "but know that Marco is already hoping you'll say yes. He asked Mrs. Chen if nice ladies ever come to live in big houses and help little boys take care of their rabbits." With that parting shot delivered with surgical precision, Dante Moretti walked out of the restaurant, leaving Elena sitting alone with a business card that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds and a choice that would determine the rest of her life. Elena stared at the eviction notice for the third time in 20 minutes, the words blurring together as exhaustion and stress made focusing impossible. The paper trembled in her hands, not from fear exactly, but from the bone-deep weariness that came from fighting the same battle over and over again with increasingly limited weapons. 72 hours to pay 3 months back rent, plus late fees and court costs. The total amount might as well have been $3 million for all the chance she had of producing it. She set the notice on her kitchen table next to the stack of medical bills from her emergency room visit 2 months ago, a kidney stone that had dropped her to the floor during a shift at Nonna's, leaving her writhing in agony until an ambulance arrived. The bills had been trickling in ever since, each one a fresh reminder that survival in America was a luxury she couldn't afford. The apartment was quiet except for the steady drip of the kitchen faucet she couldn't afford to fix, and the muffled argument coming through the paper-thin walls from the unit next door. Elena had lived here for 3 years, longer than any other place since aging out of foster care, but it had never felt like home. Home was a concept for people who had the luxury of permanence. Dante Moretti's business card lay beside the eviction notice, its expensive paper stock a stark contrast to the cheap government forms that documented her impending homelessness. She'd been carrying it in her apron pocket for 3 days, fingering its smooth edges during breaks, pulling it out to stare at the phone number that represented salvation or damnation, depending on perspective. The smart thing would be to call him, accept his offer, move into his world of security and steady paychecks and healthcare that didn't involve choosing between rent and antibiotics. Give Marco the stability he needed while building the life she'd always dreamed about. The safe thing would be to decline politely and find another way. Stay in the world she understood, where the worst that could happen was homelessness and financial ruin, not whatever consequences came with disappointing a man like Dante Moretti. Elena's phone buzzed against the table, vibrating against the stack of bills with a sound like an angry insect. The display showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Hello," she answered, expecting a debt collector or automated marketing call. "Elena, this is Mrs. Chen, Mr. Moretti's housekeeper." Elena sat up straighter, surprised by the warm, accented voice on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Chen, is everything all right? Is Marco okay?" "Marco is fine, dear. Better than fine, actually. But I wonder if you might have a few minutes to talk. I know Mr. Moretti has made you an offer, and I thought you might have questions that would be easier to ask someone who isn't your potential employer." The kindness in the older woman's voice brought unexpected tears to Elena's eyes. When was the last time someone had anticipated her needs, had thought to offer support without being asked? Yes, I have questions," Elena admitted, "but I don't want to put you in an awkward position." "Mrs." Chen's laugh was warm and knowing. "Dear, I've been with the Moretti family for 15 years. I've seen them through joy and heartbreak, triumph and tragedy. If anyone understands the gravity of what you're considering, it's me." Elena found herself nodding, even though Mrs. Chen couldn't see her. "Where would you like to meet?" "There's a small cafe on Maple Street near the Children's Centre where you volunteer. Rosie's Corner. I could be there in 30 minutes if that works for you." The fact that Mrs. Chen knew about her volunteer work shouldn't have surprised Elena. If Dante had conducted a thorough investigation, his household staff would have access to the same information. But hearing it mentioned so casually by this stranger who seemed to genuinely care about her welfare felt both unsettling and oddly comforting. "I'll be there," Elena said. 25 minutes later, Elena pushed through the door of Rosie's Corner Cafe, a cosy neighbourhood spot she'd passed countless times but never had the disposable income to visit. The interior was warm and inviting, with mismatched furniture and local art covering walls painted in cheerful yellow. The smell of fresh coffee and homemade pastries made her stomach growl, reminding her that she'd been surviving on vending machine crackers and free restaurant bread for the past week. Mrs. Chen waved from a corner booth, and Elena recognised her immediately, despite never having seen her before. She was a petite woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a neat bun and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalogue everything with maternal efficiency. She wore a simple navy cardigan over dark slacks, and everything about her radiated the kind of competent warmth that made people instinctively trust her. "Eleanor, Mrs." Chen said, rising to embrace her with the easy affection of someone greeting a beloved niece. "Thank you for coming. Please sit. I've ordered coffee and some of their famous apple turnovers. You look like you could use both." Eleanor slid into the booth, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of being fed by someone who expected nothing in return. "Mrs. Chen, I appreciate you calling, but I want to be clear. I haven't made any decisions about Mr. Moretti's offer." "Of course not, Mrs." Chen said, settling back into her seat with the grace of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "It's a life-changing proposition. Anyone with sense would need time to consider all the implications." She poured coffee from a thermal carafe, adding cream and sugar with the practiced movements of someone who had spent decades anticipating other people's needs. "But I suspect your questions aren't really about the job itself. They're about what kind of man would offer such generosity to someone he barely knows, and what that generosity might cost you." Eleanor accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Is it that obvious?" "You'd be a fool not to be suspicious," Mrs. Chen said matter-of-factly, "and everything I've learned about you suggests you're anything but foolish." The waitress arrived with apple turnovers that looked like small works of art, golden pastry gleaming with sugar glaze and steam escaping from delicate vents. Elena's mouth watered, but she hesitated, acutely aware that she couldn't afford to pay for whatever Mrs. Chen had ordered. "Eat," Mrs. Chen said gently, reading her expression with unsettling accuracy. "My treat. And before you protest, consider it a preview of what working for the Moretti family would be like. We take care of our people." Eleanor took a bite of the turnover, trying not to moan at the burst of sweet spiced apple and buttery pastry. When was the last time she'd tasted something this delicious, this carefully crafted? "Tell me about him," Elena said once she'd swallowed. "Not the business side. I understand that's complicated and probably dangerous. But as a father, as a person, what am I getting myself into?" "Mrs." Chen was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing her words with care. "Dante Moretti is one of the finest men I've ever known," she said finally, "and also one of the most complicated. He inherited responsibility for his family's enterprises when he was barely 25 after his father's death. Most people expected him to fail within 6 months. She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Instead, he transformed everything, made the business more legitimate, more focused on protection and security rather than— she gestured vaguely, other activities. He's earned respect through intelligence and integrity, not fear. "But there are still dangers," Elena said. "Yes, Mrs." Chen acknowledged without hesitation. "There are people who resent the changes he's made, who would prefer the old ways, and there are always rivals looking for weaknesses to exploit. But Elena, in 15 years, no one in Dante's immediate circle has ever been seriously harmed. He's very, very good at protecting what matters to him." Elena absorbed this, trying to reconcile the image of a dangerous businessman with the desperate father she'd comforted in the restaurant. "What about Isabella?" Elena asked. "Marco's mother." Pain flickered across Mrs. Chen's features. "A car accident, terrible weather, a drunk driver who ran a red light. Nothing to do with Dante's business, just the kind of random cruelty that reminds us how fragile life is. But Dante blames himself." "Dante blames himself for everything," Mrs. Chen said with the fond exasperation of someone who'd watched a man torture himself for years. "If it rains on a picnic, he thinks he should have checked the weather more carefully. If Marco has a nightmare, he wonders if he should have chosen a different bedtime story. Isabella's death nearly destroyed him, not just the grief, but the guilt." Elena thought about Dante's careful control, the way he'd struggled to comfort his own son. "He's afraid of failing Marco." "Terrified," Mrs. Chen confirmed, "which is why your appearance in their lives is nothing short of miraculous. For the first time in months, Marco is sleeping through the night. He's talking about his mother without tears. He asked me yesterday if I thought his mama would like the nice lady who makes honey milk." Elena's chest tightened. "That's a lot of pressure." "It is," Mrs. Chen agreed, but it's also an opportunity to be part of something beautiful, to help heal a family while building the life you deserve. She reached across the table, covering Elena's hand with her own. Her fingers were warm and calloused from decades of caring for others. I know what it's like to start over with nothing, Mrs. Chen said quietly. I came to this country when I was your age, with a suitcase and $20 in my pocket. I understand the fear of accepting help, especially from people whose world seems impossibly different from your own. What if I'm not good enough? Elena whispered, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her for 3 days. What if I fail them? Mrs. Chen's smile was radiant with certainty. Dear child, you've already succeeded. Marco talks about you constantly. Dante smiles when he mentions your name. Actually smiles, something I hadn't seen in months. You've given them hope. Elena stared down at her half-eaten turnover, overwhelmed by the weight of possibility and responsibility in equal measure. The job offer, she said finally. Is it real? All of it? The salary, the benefits, the housing? Every word, Mrs. Chen confirmed. Dante doesn't make promises he can't keep. If anything, he's probably underestimating what he'd be willing to provide once you become part of the family. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message. Her landlord demanding an immediate response about the eviction notice. The contrast between her current reality and the life Mrs. Chen was describing felt surreal, like standing at the edge of a chasm with a bridge that might be real or might be a mirage. There's something else, Mrs. Chen said gently. Something Dante probably didn't mention because he's too proud to use it as leverage, but you should know. Elena looked up, sensing the conversation was about to shift into deeper waters. Marco has been asking when his new mama is coming home. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Not nanny, not caregiver, not hired help. Mama. Oh, Elena breathed, understanding with perfect clarity that this job offer was about far more than employment. It was about family, about belonging, about stepping into a role she'd never dared to dream might be hers. So, Mrs. Chen said, signalling for the check with practiced efficiency, the question isn't whether you're qualified for the position. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept the love that's being offered along with it. Elena sat in the warm cafe, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of afternoon conversations and coffee shop bustle, and realised that her entire life had been leading to this moment. This choice, this leap of faith disguised as a job interview. Thank you, she said finally, meaning it more than Mrs. Chen could possibly understand. Call him tonight, Mrs. Chen said, standing and shrugging into her cardigan. Don't let fear make this decision for you. Trust me, the life you could build with them is worth whatever risks come with it. Elena nodded, already reaching for her phone, as Mrs. Chen disappeared into the afternoon crowd, leaving behind the lingering warmth of possibility and the terrifying prospect of choosing hope over safety. Elena stared at Dante's business card until the numbers blurred together, her phone clutched in her other hand like a lifeline she wasn't sure she had the courage to use. The eviction notice lay spread across her kitchen table alongside the stack of medical bills, creating a paper monument to all the ways her carefully constructed survival had finally crumbled. Mrs. Chen's words echoed in her mind. Don't let fear make this decision for you. But fear had been Eleanor's most reliable companion for 28 years. Fear had taught her to read the mood of a room before entering, to make herself invisible when adults fought, to never trust promises that seemed too good to be true. Fear had kept her alive through foster homes and group facilities, and aging out into a world that had no safety net for girls who started with nothing. Now fear was telling her that accepting Dante's offer was insane, that men like him didn't rescue women like her without expecting something in return, that stepping into his world would mean surrendering the small, hard-won independence she'd fought so desperately to maintain. But another voice, quieter but growing stronger, whispered different truths. Marco's small hand in hers as he shared his grief, Dante's raw vulnerability as he held his crying son. The way both of them had looked at her like she was the answer to prayers they'd been too afraid to voice. Elena picked up her phone and dialed before she could lose her nerve. Dante answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. Elena. Not a question. He'd been waiting for her call. "I have conditions," she said without preamble, bypassing pleasantries and small talk. If she was going to do this, it had to be on her terms. "I'm listening." Elena took a breath, steadying herself for a negotiation that would determine the rest of her life. 2-month trial period. If it's not working for any of us, you, me or Marco, I walk away with no hard feelings and enough severance to get back on my feet. Agreed. I want to keep working at Nonna's part-time initially. I won't burn bridges until I'm certain this is permanent. There was a pause. Elena could hear papers rustling in the background, the sound of someone accustomed to working late into the night. "That could be a security risk," Dante said finally, "having you in a public place, following a predictable schedule." "Then we'll figure out how to manage the risk," Elena replied, with more confidence than she felt. "But I'm not walking away from the only job stability I've ever had without a safety net." Another pause, longer this time. Elena held her breath, wondering if she'd pushed too hard, demanded too much. 2 shifts a week, Dante said finally. "Weekends only when I can ensure adequate security. Deal?" "Deal." Elena felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realised she'd been carrying. He was willing to compromise, to work with her needs instead of simply dictating terms. It was more than she'd dared to hope for. "What else?" Dante asked, and she could hear something that might have been amusement in his voice. "Complete honesty about any threats to Marco's safety. I can't protect him if I don't know what we're protecting him from." "Agreed, within the limits of what you need to know to keep him safe." "Clear boundaries about my personal life. I'll care for Marco like he's my own son, but I'm not signing up to be anyone's property." The silence that followed was charged with implications Elena wasn't sure she was ready to explore. When Dante spoke again, his voice was rougher, more intimate than the business tone he'd maintained throughout their negotiation. "Elena," he said quietly, "whatever else this arrangement becomes, you will always be free to leave. I'm not in the business of holding people against their will." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken, but she pressed on with her list. "Healthcare coverage starts immediately, including dental and vision." "Of course." "And I want to continue my volunteer work at the Children's Centre, Saturday mornings, unless there's an emergency with Marco." "That's not negotiable," Dante said, and for a moment Elena's heart sank. Then he continued. "It's admirable. Of course you'll continue. We'll arrange transportation and security if needed." Elena blinked, thrown by his easy support for something she'd expected to fight for. "Oh, thank you. Anything else?" Elena looked around her tiny apartment, at the life she was preparing to abandon for something unknown and potentially wonderful. "When would you want me to start?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing. Marco has been asking Mrs. Chen every day when you're coming home." "Home?" The word hit Elena with unexpected force. When was the last time anywhere had felt like home? When had anyone been waiting for her to come back? "Tomorrow," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll send a car at 10 a.m. Pack whatever you need for an extended stay. We can arrange for the rest of your belongings later." Eleanor looked around her sparse apartment. Everything important to her could fit in 2 suitcases. "I don't have much." "You have everything Marco needs," Dante said simply. "Everything we both need." After they hung up, Eleanor sat in the silence of her apartment, processing what she'd just committed to. In 12 hours, she would be living in Dante Moretti's house, caring for his son, becoming part of a family she'd known for less than a week. It was insane. It was terrifying. It was the first truly hopeful thing that had happened to her in years. Elena started packing. The next morning arrived grey and drizzly, the kind of October weather that made everything feel temporary and uncertain. Elena stood at her window with a cup of instant coffee, watching for the car Dante had promised, while her packed suitcases waited by the door like patient soldiers. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through every possible catastrophe that could result from this decision. What if Marco decided he didn't like her after all? What if Dante's business attracted the kind of attention that put children in danger? What if she was walking into a situation she was too naive to recognize as a trap? But then she remembered the way Marco had fallen asleep against her shoulder, the trust in his small body as he surrendered to exhaustion, the way Dante had looked at her like she was salvation itself when his son finally stopped crying. Whatever risks came with this choice, the alternative was eviction, debt, and the slow dissolution of everything she'd worked to build. At least with Dante, she'd be taking an active role in shaping her future instead of simply reacting to forces beyond her control. A black sedan pulled up to the curb exactly at 10 a.m., sleek and expensive but not ostentatious. The driver was a compact man in his 40s with greying hair and alert eyes that swept the street automatically before he got out to approach her building. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm Vincent, Mr. Moretti's driver. He asked me to help you with your luggage." Vincent's manner was professional but warm, the kind of courtesy that suggested genuine respect rather than mere duty. He handled her battered suitcases with the same care he probably used for designer luggage, making no judgment about their obvious age and wear. "Mr. Moretti is at the house with Marco," Vincent explained, as they settled into the sedan's leather interior. "The boy has been watching for you since breakfast." Elena's chest tightened with a mixture of affection and anxiety. "How is he?" "Excited, nervous. He spent 20 minutes this morning showing Mrs. Chen all of Coniglio's favourite spots in the house, so you'd know where to find them if the rabbit got lost." The image of Marco giving Coniglio a house tour made Eleanor smile despite her nerves. "And Mr. Moretti?" Vincent glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression thoughtful. "Relieved, I think. It's been a long time since that house felt like a family home. You're going to change that." They drove through neighbourhoods Elena recognised, gradually giving way to areas she'd only seen in magazine spreads. The houses grew larger, the lawns more manicured, the gates more imposing. Elena pressed her face to the window like a child, watching a world she'd never imagined inhabiting unfold outside the car. "Nervous?" Vincent asked kindly. "Terrified," Elena admitted. "That's normal, but if it helps, I've been working for the Moretti family for 8 years. Mr. Dante is a good man in a complicated business. He'll protect you and treat you fairly, and that little boy of his, well, he's been waiting his whole life for someone like you." Elena nodded, trying to absorb the reassurance while her pulse hammered against her throat. The Moretti estate appeared around a bend in the road like something from a dream. It was smaller than Elena had expected, elegant rather than ostentatious, with clean lines and warm stone that suggested old money comfort rather than new money display. Mature oak trees framed a circular driveway, and carefully maintained gardens promised beauty in every season. It was the kind of house Eleanor had imagined when she was small, lying in narrow foster care beds and dreaming about what a real home might look like. Vincent pulled up to the front entrance, where Dante stood waiting with Marco beside him. Even from a distance, Elena could see the tension in Dante's posture, the way he kept one protective hand on his son's shoulder while scanning the approach road with practised vigilance. Marco broke free the moment the car stopped, running toward the sedan with Coniglio clutched against his chest and a smile brighter than the pale morning sun. "Elena, you came. You really came." His voice was pure joy, uncomplicated by adult fears or calculations. Elena stepped out of the car and found herself immediately wrapped in a fierce hug from a 6-year-old who smelled like syrup and shampoo and hope. Marco's small arms circled her waist with complete trust, and Elena felt something fundamental shift in her chest. This was why she was here, not for the money or the security or the chance to escape her problems. She was here because this little boy needed her, and she needed to be needed by someone who wouldn't abandon her when things got difficult. "Hello, sweetheart," Elena said, crouching down to Marco's level. "I missed you too." "Did you bring clothes to stay forever?" Marco asked with the directness of childhood. Elena laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "I brought enough clothes to get started. We'll figure out forever as we go." She looked up to find Dante watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. Relief, certainly, gratitude, but underneath it all, something that looked almost like wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe his impossible solution had actually arrived. "Welcome home," Dante said simply, and Elena felt the words settle around her shoulders like a warm coat. Home. After 28 years of searching, she'd finally found it in the most unexpected place, with the most unlikely family, and for the first time since she could remember, Elena Rodriguez stopped running from her future and walked toward it with her head held high. The Moretti house was nothing like Elena had imagined from the outside. Where she'd expected cold marble and intimidating grandeur, she found warm hardwood floors, comfortable furniture that invited actual use, and windows that filled every room with natural light. It felt like a home that had been lived in and loved, not a museum designed to impress visitors. Mrs. Chen appeared in the foyer like a guardian angel, her face radiant with genuine welcome. "Elena dear, perfect timing. I was just about to start lunch. Marco specifically requested grilled cheese cut into rabbit shapes." "Can Elena see my room first?" Marco asked, bouncing on his toes with barely contained excitement. "I want to show her where Coniglio sleeps and all the good hiding spots." Dante nodded, his expression soft as he watched his son's enthusiasm. "Give her the full tour, but let Elena settle in first. Vincent will bring up her bags." Elena followed Marco up a curved staircase, noting family photographs lining the walls, candid shots of birthday parties and holidays, pictures of a laughing woman with dark hair who had to be Isabella, Marco's mother. The photos didn't feel like shrines to grief. They felt like celebrations of a life well lived and deeply missed. "That's Mama," Marco said, noticing Elena's attention on a particularly beautiful portrait of Isabella holding baby Marco in a garden. "Papa says she's watching over us from heaven, but sometimes I think she's just hiding really well." Elena's chest tightened at the simple faith in his voice. "What makes you think that?" "Because sometimes I smell her perfume when I'm sad, and yesterday, when I was worried you might not come, I found this." Marco pulled a small white feather from his pocket. "It was on my pillow when I woke up. Mama used to say angels leave feathers when they want you to know everything will be okay." Eleanor knelt down to examine the feather, touched by Marco's need to find signs that his mother's love continued beyond death. "That's a very special feather. Cornelio must have been so relieved to see it." Marco nodded seriously. "He was. He doesn't like it when I worry." They continued down the hallway, past what Elena assumed were guest rooms and offices, until Marco threw open a door at the end of the corridor. "This is my room." The space was a perfect blend of childhood wonder and sophisticated taste. The walls were painted a soft blue-grey, with built-in bookshelves displaying an impressive collection of picture books and chapter books. A window seat looked out over the gardens, piled with cushions that invited reading and daydreaming. But it was the details that made Elena's heart clench, drawings taped to one wall that were clearly Marco's artwork, a collection of toy cars arranged with mathematical precision, and in the place of honour on the nightstand, a framed photo of Isabella reading to a younger Marco. "It's beautiful," Elena said honestly. "I can tell this is a room where someone is very loved." Marco beamed, then grabbed her hand to show her the most important feature. "And this is Cornelio's bed." He pointed to an elaborate dollhouse that had been converted into a rabbit mansion, complete with tiny furniture and miniature carrots in the kitchen. "Coniglio lives like a king," Elena observed, delighting in Marco's proud expression. "Papa built it for me when Mama went to heaven. He said Cornelio needed a special place to feel safe when the world got scary." Elena glanced at the intricate craftsmanship of the dollhouse. imagining Dante working late into the night, channeling his grief into creating something beautiful for his son. The image of this powerful man hunched over tiny furniture, painting miniature walls, made her chest ache with unexpected tenderness. "And this," Marco continued, pulling her toward a door she hadn't noticed, "is going to be your room. Papa said you needed a place that was just yours, but close enough that I could find you if I had nightmares." Elena's breath caught as Marco opened the door to reveal a suite that was larger than her entire apartment had been. The sitting area featured comfortable armchairs arranged around a fireplace, with built-in shelves that begged to be filled with books. Through an open doorway she could see a bedroom with a king-size bed covered in crisp white linens and windows that overlooked the garden. "Do you like it?" Marco asked anxiously. "Papa picked out all the furniture himself. He said you needed somewhere beautiful because beautiful people deserve beautiful things." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks at the second-hand compliment. "It's perfect, Marco, more than perfect." And it was. The suite managed to be both luxurious and welcoming, furnished with pieces that suggested comfort rather than display. Someone had stocked the sitting area with fresh flowers and left a basket of gourmet coffee and teas on a side table. The bathroom, larger than most people's bedrooms, featured a soaking tub that looked like it could wash away years of stress. "There's a button by your bed that calls Mrs. Chen if you need anything," Marco explained, with the seriousness of someone sharing crucial information. "And another one that calls Papa if something scary happens. He showed me where they are in case I ever need to use them." Elena noted the security considerations woven seamlessly into what appeared to be simple hospitality. Dante hadn't missed any details in preparing for her arrival. A soft knock interrupted her examination of the suite. Dante stood in the doorway, carrying her suitcases with an ease that suggested they weighed nothing. "I thought you might want these," he said, setting them down near the walk-in closet. "Marco, why don't you let Elena unpack while we check on lunch?" "But I want to show her the library and the music room and the pool and—" "After lunch," Dante said firmly but kindly. "Elena needs time to settle in. There will be plenty of opportunities for tours." Marco looked disappointed but nodded. "Okay, but after grilled cheese I'm showing you the garden. Mrs. Chen grows the best tomatoes, and there's a swing that Papa hung just for me." After they left, Elena found herself alone in luxury she'd never imagined possessing. She unpacked her few belongings, worn jeans, discount store blouses, a single dress she'd bought for job interviews, and hung them in a closet designed to hold 10 times as much. Her things looked lost in all that space, like refugees seeking shelter in a palace. She was folding her last sweater when she heard voices drifting through the window from the garden below. Curious, Elena looked out to see Dante on his phone, pacing the length of a stone terrace while Marco played nearby with a collection of toy trucks. Even from a distance, Elena could tell the conversation was tense. Dante's posture radiated controlled anger, his free hand clenched into a fist at his side. She couldn't make out words, but his tone carried the kind of authority that probably made grown men reconsider their life choices. When he hung up, Dante stood still for a long moment, his head tilted back as if seeking patience from the sky. Then Marco called out something about his truck being stuck, and Elena watched Dante's entire demeanour transform as he crouched down to help his son. The contrast was striking, dangerous businessman to devoted father in the span of seconds. It reminded Elena that the man who'd offered her sanctuary was more complicated than his quiet courtesy suggested. A knock on her door interrupted her observation. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Chen, or maybe Marco. Instead, Dante appeared in her doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "I wanted to make sure you have everything you need." "More than I need," Elena said honestly. "This is beautiful. Thank you." "You're welcome." Dante stepped into the sitting area, but maintained a careful distance, as if respecting the boundaries of her space. "I also wanted to discuss Marco's routine, if you're ready." Elena nodded, settling into one of the armchairs and gesturing for him to do the same. The conversation that followed was purely practical. Marco's school schedule, his after-school activities, his preferred foods and bedtime routine. But Eleanor found herself studying Dante as much as listening to his words. Up close, in the natural light streaming through her windows, she could see details she'd missed in the restaurant's dimmer atmosphere. The faint scar along his left temple, the way he rubbed his thumb against his index finger when discussing something that worried him, the careful way he watched her face, as if cataloguing her reactions for future reference. Marco sometimes has nightmares, Dante said, his voice dropping slightly. Usually about car crashes or being separated from family. He responds well to physical comfort, holding hands, sitting close while you talk. Nothing seems to help except time and patience. Elena heard what he wasn't saying, that Dante felt helpless in the face of his son's trauma, that he'd probably spent countless nights trying to comfort a child whose pain he couldn't fix. "What about you?" Elena asked gently. "Do you sleep?" Dante's eyebrows rose slightly, as if surprised by her directness. Eventually, "That's not an answer." For a moment Elena thought he might deflect or change the subject. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and met her gaze with something that looked almost like relief. "Not well," he admitted. "Not since Isabella died. There are too many things that require attention, too many people depending on decisions I make. Sleep feels like a luxury I can't afford." Elena recognized the weight of responsibility in his voice, the burden of being the person everyone else turned to when things went wrong. "Grief insomnia is real," she said softly, "and so is caregiver burnout. You can't pour from an empty cup indefinitely." "Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Rodriguez?" There was gentle teasing in his tone, but also genuine interest. Elena felt herself relaxing despite the surreal nature of offering advice to one of the most powerful men in the city. "It's my experience as someone who's spent a lot of time being tired," she said simply. "Marco needs you healthy and present, not running on fumes and good intentions." Dante was quiet for a moment, processing this observation. "And what do you suggest?" "Start small, regular meals even if you're not hungry, limit caffeine after 3 p.m. and maybe—" Eleanor hesitated, then pushed forward. "Maybe let other people help carry some of the weight. Delegation isn't abandonment." Something flickered across Dante's features. Surprise, perhaps, at being seen so clearly by someone he barely knew. "Is this what having you around is going to be like?" he asked. "Unsolicited advice about my self-care?" Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to overstep." "Don't apologize," Dante said quickly. "I'm not complaining. It's been a long time since anyone worried about whether I was taking care of myself." The admission hung between them, more intimate than Elena had expected. She found herself studying his face, noting the tension around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much responsibility carried alone. Mrs. Chen's voice drifted up from downstairs, calling them to lunch. Dante stood, smoothing his shirt with unconscious precision. "Thank you," he said, as they prepared to join Marco. "For all of it. I know this arrangement is unconventional, but watching Marco with you, seeing him smile and laugh and act like a normal 6-year-old, is the first time in months I've felt like we might actually be okay." Elena looked up at him, struck by the vulnerability in his admission. This was the man behind the expensive suits and careful control. A father desperate to heal his child and afraid he wasn't strong enough to do it alone. "We will be okay," Elena said, with more certainty than she felt. "All of us. Sometimes families come together in unexpected ways, but that doesn't make them less real." Dante's smile was the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "Come on," he said, offering her his arm with old-world courtesy. "Let's go eat some rabbit-shaped grilled cheese and pretend this is how families are supposed to work." As they walked downstairs together, Elena realized that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly how families were supposed to work. Not perfectly, but with intention and care, and the willingness to keep trying even when the path forward wasn't clear. For the first time in her life, Elena Rodriguez was part of something bigger than survival. She was part of a family. 2 weeks into her new life, Elena had fallen into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Mornings began with Marco's excited chatter over breakfast, afternoons involved homework help and creative play, and evenings settled into the comfortable routine of dinner, baths and bedtime stories. She'd even managed her weekend shifts at Nonna's without incident, though Vincent's constant presence in the dining room reminded her that normal was a relative concept in the Moretti world. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. Elena was in the garden with Marco, helping him build an elaborate fort for Cornelio using fallen branches and colourful autumn leaves. The October sun was warm on their backs, and Marco's laughter rang across the manicured grounds as he directed the construction with the intense focus of a 6-year-old architect. "Cornelio says the door needs to be bigger," Marco announced, carefully adjusting a stick that served as the entrance beam. "Rabbits don't like to feel trapped." Elena smiled, noting how much more confident Marco had become in the past 2 weeks. His nightmares had decreased, his appetite had improved, and most importantly, he'd started talking about the future again, making plans for Halloween costumes and Christmas presents and summer adventures. "Smart rabbit," Elena said, helping him widen the doorway. "Everyone needs to know they can leave if they want to." "Even you?" Marco asked with the directness that still caught Elena off guard. "Even me," Elena confirmed, though the thought of leaving this garden, this child, this unexpected family felt increasingly impossible to imagine. They were debating the proper architectural requirements for rabbit windows when Mrs. Chen appeared on the terrace, her usual calm demeanour replaced by something that looked almost like worry. "Marco, sweetheart," she called, her voice carefully controlled. "Your father needs to see you and Elena in his office." Elena felt ice form in her stomach. In 2 weeks, Dante had never summoned them to his office. Their interactions had been warm but informal, shared meals, homework help, bedtime routines. The office was where he conducted business, the part of his world that Elena understood she wasn't meant to see. Marco, oblivious to the undercurrents, jumped up with enthusiasm. "Maybe Papa wants to see Coniglio's new fort." "Maybe," Mrs. Chen said gently, but her eyes met Elena's over Marco's head with an expression that suggested this wasn't about fort viewing. They found Dante behind a massive oak desk in a room that looked like it belonged to a Fortune 500 CEO rather than a family patriarch. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the grounds, but the view was currently obscured by security monitors that Elena hadn't noticed before. 2 men in expensive suits flanked Dante's chair, bodyguards she realised with a start, noting the careful way they positioned themselves to watch all entrances. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Papa!" Marco ran toward the desk with his usual exuberance, but stopped short when he noticed the serious expression surrounding him. "Is everything okay?" Dante's face softened as he focused on his son, but Eleanor could see the tension radiating from his carefully controlled posture. "Everything's fine, Marco, but I need to ask you some questions about school." Eleanor remained near the door, suddenly aware that she was witnessing something she probably shouldn't see. The men flanking Dante's desk studied her with the professional assessment of people trained to identify threats, and she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her clothing. "Come in, Elena," Dante said quietly, noting her hesitation. "This concerns you too." She moved closer, but maintained distance from the desk, positioning herself where she could reach Marco quickly if needed. Every instinct she'd developed in foster care was screaming that this room contained danger, even if she couldn't identify its exact source. "Marco," Dante said gently, "have you noticed anyone new at school lately? Adults who don't belong there, maybe asking questions about you or our family?" Marco's brow furrowed in concentration. "Mrs. Patterson asked if you were coming to the parent-teacher conference, and the new lunch lady asked what kind of car you drive." Eleanor felt her pulse spike. Those weren't innocent questions from curious school staff. Those were intelligence-gathering attempts from people who had no business knowing details about the Moretti family's movements. Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What did you tell them?" "I said you have lots of cars, but you like the blue one best because it has heated seats," Marco replied honestly. "And I told Mrs. Patterson that Elena might come to conferences now because she helps take care of me." One of the bodyguards shifted slightly, and Eleanor caught the subtle communication that passed between him and Dante. Whatever was happening, the mention of Elena's name had escalated the threat level. "Marco," Dante continued, his voice maintaining its gentle tone despite the undercurrent of steel, "from now on, if anyone asks questions about our family, I want you to tell them that you don't know, and they should talk to Mrs. Patterson or me. Can you do that?" "Am I in trouble?" Marco's voice was small, confused by the sudden shift in his world. "No, sweetheart," Elena said quickly, moving to kneel beside his chair. "You're not in trouble at all. Sometimes grown-ups ask questions because they're curious, but family information is private. It's like how we don't tell strangers where we keep Coniglio's special treats." Marco nodded, accepting this explanation with the resilience Elena had learned to admire. "Okay, can I go back to building the fort now?" "In a minute," Dante said. "I need to talk to Elena first. Why don't you tell Mrs. Chen about the fort design? She might have ideas for making it even better." After Marco left with obvious reluctance, the atmosphere in the room shifted into something more dangerous. Elena found herself facing three men whose expressions had hardened into professional assessment, and she realized that her comfortable integration into this family had been temporary shelter from a storm that was now approaching. "Sit," Dante said, gesturing to the chair Marco had vacated. Elena remained standing. "What's going on?" "Vincent Torino," said one of the bodyguards, a man Elena hadn't been introduced to. "He's been asking questions about you specifically. Your work schedule at the restaurant, your living situation, your relationship with Marco." Elena's blood turned cold. "Who is Vincent Torino?" Dante's green eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her feel pinned in place. "Someone who wants to hurt my family, and now, by extension, someone who wants to hurt you." The words hit Elena like physical blows. In 2 weeks of comfortable domesticity, she'd almost forgotten that accepting Dante's offer meant accepting his enemies as well. She'd been playing house while real threats circled closer to the people she'd come to love. "What does he want?" Elena asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "Control," Dante replied simply. "The old ways of doing business, the methods my father used before I changed our operations. Torino represents families who think my approach to leadership is weak, who want to return to intimidation and violence as primary tools." Elena absorbed this, understanding that she was receiving information most people in Dante's world probably died for knowing. "And he thinks I'm a weakness he can exploit." "He thinks," Dante said carefully, "that Marco's attachment to you makes both of you vulnerable. He's not entirely wrong." Elena felt sick. Her presence hadn't just brought comfort to this family. It had brought danger. Every moment of happiness she'd shared with Marco, every laugh they'd enjoyed, every bedtime story she'd read had somehow painted a target on their backs. "I should leave," she said quietly. "If I'm putting Marco at risk." "No." The word came out sharper than Dante probably intended. He stood, moving around the desk with fluid grace that reminded Elena of a predator protecting territory. "Leaving now would be worse than staying. It would confirm that you matter enough to influence my decisions." "But I do matter," Elena said, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "Don't I? To both of you." Something flickered across Dante's features. Surprise, recognition, something that looked almost like relief. "Yes," he said simply, "you matter, more than is probably wise." The admission hung between them, charged with implications Elena wasn't sure she was ready to explore. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we increase security," Dante replied, his tone shifting back into business mode. "No more solo trips anywhere, including the restaurant. Vincent will shadow you constantly when you're not in the house. Marco's school has been notified to watch for suspicious activity." Elena nodded, trying to process the reality that her life had just become something from a movie she'd never wanted to star in. "There's something else," Dante continued, and something in his voice made Elena's stomach clench with fresh dread. "Torino's people have been asking about your foster care background. Specifically, they've been trying to locate your former caseworker and some of the families you lived with." Elena's vision blurred as the implication hit her. He's looking for leverage. People from your past who might be willing to provide information or who could be threatened to control your behavior, Dante confirmed. "I've already moved to protect the ones we could locate, but—" "Sarah Martinez," Elena whispered, thinking of her last foster sister, the one person from her past she'd maintained contact with. "She's in nursing school in Houston. She doesn't know anything about this world. She's completely innocent." "Not anymore. Sigya and Root," one of the bodyguards said grimly. "Torino's people approached her yesterday, posed as reporters doing a story about foster care success stories." Elena's knees gave out, and she found herself in the chair she'd refused earlier, trying to breathe through the panic that was threatening to overwhelm her. Everyone she cared about was now in danger, because she'd dared to accept kindness, to believe she deserved a family, to think she could escape the consequences of a childhood that had marked her as expendable. "This is my fault," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I brought this danger into your home, into Marco's life. I should never have—" "Elena." Dante's voice cut through her spiral of self-blame like a blade. He was suddenly beside her chair, his presence radiating controlled intensity. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, surprised by the fierce protectiveness she saw there. "You didn't bring danger into our lives," Dante said firmly. "You brought light, hope, the first real joy Marco has felt since his mother died. Torino would have found another way to threaten us eventually. That's what men like him do. The difference is that now we have something worth fighting for." Elena stared at him, trying to process the weight of what he was saying. "You're not responsible for other people's evil choices," Dante continued, "but you are responsible for choosing whether to let that evil win. Torino wants you to run, wants you to abandon Marco, because caring about him has become complicated. Are you going to give him that victory?" Elena thought about Marco's excited face as he showed her Coniglio's fort, about the trust in his small hand when he reached for her during nightmares, about the way Dante's eyes softened when he watched them together. She thought about Sarah and the innocent people being pulled into this nightmare because they'd once shown kindness to a foster kid who'd grown up to accidentally fall in love with a dangerous family. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not running, but I need to know how to protect him, how to protect all of them." Dante's smile was sharp as a blade, filled with deadly promise. "Leave that to me. Your job is to keep being exactly who you are, the woman who saw my son's pain and chose to heal it. Consequences be damned." Elena nodded, understanding that she'd just crossed another invisible line in her relationship with this family. She was no longer just Marco's caregiver or Dante's employee. She was part of something worth killing for, and apparently worth dying for too.